Welcome, everyone. We still have a few people logging in, so we'll give them a minute or two to get settled, and then we'll get underway. Okay, welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining the Link Center today for this shared learning group focused on the topic of navigating risky behaviors. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items while we get started. The session is being recorded, and the recording and the transcripts and the slide deck will all be made available on our website. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with others. Attendees cannot see the names of other attendees, and all attendees are muted. Please use the chat function in Zoom to communicate with other attendees and the host during the webinar. You can use the chat by clicking on chat at the bottom of your screen. Be aware that your name will appear in the chat if you make a comment, and you can change your display name by clicking on those three little dots next to your name and selecting rename. We will have representatives from the Link Center watching the chat and responding throughout the session today. If you'd like to submit a question or a comment privately to the host and panelists, you can do that by clicking on the Q&A function or using the chat. We have live captioning and ASL interpreters present today. We will be spotlighting the active speaker and the ASL interpreter throughout the webinar. If you click on View in your Zoom screen, you can change the way you see the panelists. And if you have any trouble with your view, you can let us know in the chat box. At this time, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Stacy Nonemaker, who's going to get us started with today's presentation. Stacy, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. It is so great to see so many people joining us today. I'm really excited about the second day of hosting these shared learning groups on the topic of navigating risky behaviors. By way of a visual description, I am a middle-aged white woman with glasses. I have wavy brown hair. I'm sitting in front of a white background with a white striped shirt and a black sweater. As Stephanie said, my name is Stacy Nonemaker, and I am with NASDIS, who's one of the partners of the Link Center. Again, a grant funded by the Administration for Community Living. And because we have such great content to cover and talk to you about today, if you want to find out more about the Link Center, you don't really know what's happening, we do have a website. So you can use the QR code that's on your screen or the link. But we really encourage everyone to come up to the website, check out the resources, information, things that we have been curating, collecting, vetting, putting them up here for you all, so that together we can figure out how to better support individuals with co-occurring conditions. And really looking to give people the tools and the resources to really do that. So our website is still relatively new, and we're constantly putting things up there, news and information, resources. So we highly encourage you to check us out and to check back often. So about our time together today, I already mentioned that this is our second day of gathering. Yesterday, we held two gatherings, one with direct support professionals, one with clinical professionals. And today we're talking with families of people with lived experience. And then later on this afternoon, we'll be talking to individuals with lived experience. Essentially, the content in all four of these presentations is the same. So while we do designate the gatherings by different roles, we don't want to box anybody into a role and invite anybody to jump up on any or all of the shared learning groups, but just want to be clear that the information is pretty much the same. We do tailor and change some of the content a little bit for each of the groups. And the content that really you'll be seeing today and we'll be walking through is a collaboration among the Link Center partners, and there's many of us. And they include people with lived experience, researchers, and people who work on policy issues. And as Stephanie said, we are recording and transcribing today's meeting. And so you'll have all of the materials and the recording on the Link Center website when we post that there. And we just encourage you all to share this information. We're hoping to get this out far and wide. We feel like the topics that we're identifying along with all of our other partners really is, pertinent and important to better supporting people with co-occurring conditions. All right, so what are we going to be doing today? Well, first of all, I'm inviting you all to take a moment and just say hello in the chat. You can put your name if you feel comfortable. You can share any group or association or membership that you may have. You can even let us know where you're dialing in from today. And today I'm dialing in from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We will be talking about navigating risky behaviors, and we look at these shared learning groups and really emphasize the shared part of the shared learning groups, because what we're going to do is share with you all, as the Link Center, things that we've been thinking about this topic and resources, not exhaustive, but some resources that we think are helpful when we're thinking about supporting people to navigate risky behaviors. But then again, emphasizing the shared part, we're also looking to you all and to help us really understand your perspectives and reactions to what we're sharing. Help us understand what resources, trainings, and go-to information that you have at your fingertips that helps us think about navigating risky behaviors. And we'll also provide some time at the end really to dive into and think about applying what we just heard and dive into the topic using a scenario where we present some challenges and talk through solutions to navigating risky behavior. So, we'll be looking for your participation later on and really be trying to understand from your perspective how you're thinking about this topic. So we have a steering committee that's part of the Link Center, whom I'll talk about in just a moment. But through the last year of doing quarterly shared learning groups, we've developed a few slides that we like to show during every shared learning group, just to get us all on the same page and to provide really a safe, welcoming space for us all to share and for us all to share our perspectives, understand others' perspectives and experiences. So these are really some stage setting slides, if you will. This meeting will be talking about people's experience in being supported. Some people have experienced trauma, and that makes it hard to recover and move forward. We encourage you all to take care of yourself, do what is necessary for your comfort and care. And really want to emphasize we should be gentle with ourselves and each other because sometimes this work is hard to do. We celebrate that we are all individuals from different backgrounds. We celebrate that we have shared experiences to learn from, and we know that we are each unique with our own experiences in the world. And we welcome and honor that diversity with all of you that have joined today. And then finally, we listen and share with open minds and kindness, and we do not judge or blame others for what they share. Again, just really looking to create this safe, welcoming space for you all to feel comfortable sharing your own experiences, your thoughts, your opinions. So we at the Link Center can learn from our communities and understand from different perspectives what you all are thinking about, what you all are experiencing when it comes to the topic of navigating risky behaviors. So I've noticed that a few of you have said hello in the chat. Thank you so much, and it's great to see many of you on here from across the nation. So I'm going to ask you to still, stay in the chat here and really want to get a baseline or just an understanding of where your head is at when you're thinking about this topic or why you showed up here today. And our question, and this is really helpful to my colleagues who will be talking for the rest of the time about navigating risky behaviors. But what comes to mind when you hear the words risky behavior? So I'm just going to take a moment. Silence is my friend, and let you think about that and pop some thoughts into the chat. Coming in already, great. So I see destructive behavior to self or others, making poor decisions, elopement, risky behavior seems like someone will get hurt or have serious consequences. Personal harm, harm to others, damaging property, not having the ability to stop oneself. So these are all really, really great. And like I said, there's, there is no wrong answer, right? This is helping us really understand, what you're coming to the table with, your understanding of risky behaviors. And spoiler alert, at the end of today, we're going to ask you if anything that is shared today is helping you think differently about risky behaviors. And the last one I'm seeing is from Janet, escalating. Great. So thanks so much for that. And again, it's really helpful to hear where you all are coming from. And like I mentioned before, at the Link Center here, we are very privileged to have what we call a steering committee. And that is really 14 people with lived experience, very varied lived experience, who represent states across the nation. And they really guide or drive the work that we do of the Link Center. We meet with them, we talk to them about different things that we're thinking about as partners. And really we were very honored to be able to bring everyone together in person in September. And one of the topics that we talked about was navigating risky behaviors. So what you're seeing in front of you is a graphic representation of that robust discussion that we had when we were together. And today you're going to hear some of these words and others throughout the content. And we have the permission of all the steering committee members, where we identify that these are their words that we're using to reinforce some of the points that we're making. But really, we just want to pause and give thanks and acknowledge the steering committee's commitment to informing this work and to their ongoing engagement with us, to helping us better understand from their perspective, certain aspects of pushing forward to better support people with co-occurring conditions. So we're really excited to be able to lift their voices in today's shared learning group. All right, so here's where I get to turn it over to my colleagues from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And I just want to turn it over to Jules Good and Nora Pervez. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Stacy, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. My name is Jules Good. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the programs coordinator at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. As a quick visual description, I'm a white person with big glasses and short pink hair, wearing a black t-shirt. And also just wanted to share that kind of my background in coming into talking about this topic is I am a dual diagnosed person with a few developmental disabilities and mental health disabilities. And I'm also someone who has had personal experience with navigating risky behaviors, as it were. So yeah, I will turn it over to my colleague Noor.
Thank you so much. Hey everyone, my name is Noor. I use here they pronouns. I'm the community engagement manager over at ASAN. As a visual description, I am a South Asian person with curly black hair piled up into a bun. I have kind of tortoiseshell glasses, a checkered shirt, and I am sitting in my office. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So a kind of jumping off point here that I always like to kind of start with for this presentation. If you've done some reading about the idea of behaviors or behavioral supports, when ASAN did a project looking at behavior supports, what we noticed and what a lot of folks we talked to noticed is that not everyone means the same thing when they talk about quote unquote behaviors that need support or intervention. So we're going to show you why that's important throughout the presentation. But for the purposes of what we're talking about here, it's important to recognize that while literally behaviors are anything that we do, like lifting a chair is a form of behavior because it's an action you're taking. But behaviors in this context usually mean something that's considered weird or disruptive that a disabled person does. Now, having said that out loud, you'll notice that that is incredibly vague and not super helpful as a definition. We'll get into that. That's an important piece of this. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by risky behaviors in this context? So we're talking about stuff that harms ourselves or other people. So you'll hear us talk about the use of substances. What we're highlighting here is substance misuse. So in context, assuming you're looking at a disabled adult, having a drink at a bar is not an inherently bad behavior, right? Like anyone who is of legal drinking age having a beer at a bar is not unusual. Substance misuse in this context is talking about using substances in a way that puts people at risk of justice system involvement. So dealing with the police, the fire department, basically anything that can put themselves and other people in danger. We're also talking about things like self-soothing in a way that causes harm. So for example, hair pulling, biting yourself until you bleed. This also covers attempts at regulating that can result in harm to others around you. So for example, yelling or speaking angrily to try and feel less scared, but making verbal threats to other people in the process is something that someone might be doing to try and regulate their own nervous system and emotions, but in the process, they are causing harm to someone else. And one thing that we're going to come back to a whole bunch throughout this presentation is context. So someone yelling and screaming at a baseball game, for example, because people are energized and cheering for their team or kind of throwing jabs at the other team, that's not unusual, right? That's not something that needs to be kind of put into this category because that's not something that's causing harm. It might come across as like overzealous in some people's opinions, but that's not something that's inherently dangerous, right? So we're going to revisit this in a bunch of different ways, but it's important to think about kind of the surroundings in which things are happening when kind of thinking about whether or not to classify it as risky. So what do we mean by risky behaviors? We also mean that doing risky behaviors inherently does not make someone a bad person in either direction. Most of the time, someone doing risky behavior does not inherently mean to cause harm. Does that mean that it can't? No, there can absolutely be times where people still cause harm as a result of it. What we're meaning here, though, is that doing a risky behavior does not inherently mean that's someone's intent. So while talking about this, a concept that we're going to touch on more later, but that I kind of want to foreground here, is the idea of dignity of risk, which is the idea that we've got to take risks in order to learn and grow and understand stuff. So, for example, assuming you've got someone who is capable of walking, when they're learning to walk for the first time, and like if you picture a little kid, for example, well, if they're learning how to stand up and how to lean against things and how to balance themselves as they're trying to move forward, even when they're learning how to crawl for the first time, for example, they're going to fall down a whole bunch, right? Not because they're trying to be reckless or anything, but because they're learning. Part of how they're starting to understand how that forward movement works is learning how to get up, learning how to avoid falling, and what methods you can use to do that. Leaning against furniture, balancing yourself, holding someone's hand, whatever it might be, right? Dignity of risk is that concept, but applied to life more broadly. So, in order to learn why it's important to wear a helmet while you're skating, for example. If you trip and fall while you're practicing in your living room and you bonk your head on something, and oh, okay, yeah, that hurt. I don't want to do that again. If I wear a helmet, it won't hurt the next time I do that, right? And there's degrees of that where some of it is stuff that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We know that, for example, you wear a seatbelt when you get into a car, but certain amounts of that are necessary in order for people to learn and understand how to interact with our environment and how to do certain things. Next slide, please. So when we talk about risky behaviors, we also want to think about what risk factors kind of lead towards them. These things don't come out of nowhere. Risky behaviors typically are showing us an unmet need. So if you were here for the August shared learning group, this touches on the idea of social determinants of health. So this idea that our environment and our background shapes what we do. So basically, the things that we've learned throughout our life, whether that's from the people around us, from our home environment, from school, work, or friends, all contribute to what we do. Next slide, please. So while thinking about social determinants of health, I know that we've all heard the word trauma a whole bunch. In this particular context, when we talk about trauma, I think, especially as folks who are very close to people who are doing a risky behavior, it can be easy to kind of zoom in and think very individually, in the sense that, for example, someone might think, well, this person maybe didn't have what we would immediately think of as an individual level trauma. So things like child abuse, hate crime, direct forms of violence that are very literal and easily processed as a form of trauma. What folks can sometimes have kind of less experience thinking about is the ways that structural trauma can kind of boil into individual experiences as well. So when I say structural trauma, what comes to people's mind tends to be things like racism, sexism, ableism, like the big stuff in a very literal way. So, for example, again, going back to hate crime, people speaking negatively towards you, bullying, any of the very direct literal translations. And that all absolutely is trauma, don't get me wrong. That is absolutely something that qualifies towards people self-regulating in ways that can be harmful to themselves or others. The part that tends to get looked over because it's a little bit more in the weeds is the stuff that is kind of systemic and built in. So, for example, we know that, and follow me for a second here, this is going to wrap back around. So we know that, for example, racism and people of color in general tend to deal with um, heightened rates of asthma, chronic illness, and broader like health challenges. When we drill down into some of the data around that, when we take an environmental lens, obviously this isn't going to apply to everyone, but one way we can understand how this works for some people is that for people of color who are lower income, and especially who live in or around cities, there is a very strong likelihood of being close to pollution, particularly at higher levels of pollution when compared to their white counterparts who are in a similar income bracket. So when we look at that, you follow that chain kind of further down their lives. If you have someone who has grown up around, let's say, a lot of smog, a lot of pollution, we know that by the numbers, they're likelier to develop breathing conditions, health conditions, asthma. We also know that if folks already have chronic illnesses, that's likelier to make it worse. So, okay, these are things that are a byproduct of that. That's harmful, sure. How does that boil into individual behaviors? Well, when people are sick and sicker more of the time, you both are likelier to run into the day-to-day examples of systemic ableism that can make it harder to leave your house. So for example, say that you're suddenly a lot weaker, you need to use a mobility aid. You now are going to have to deal with trying to get transit to go places. You're going to have to deal with elevators breaking down. You're going to have to deal with issues around disabled parking and paperwork and all of these logistical hurdles that are involved with being disabled in a society, just in general. And then you add in the fact that anytime you're repeatedly going to, say, a medical office, more often than people who are not as sick, not as involved in the healthcare system, you're likelier, unfortunately, just by the raw numbers, to come across someone who mistreats you or who, God forbid, does some type of medical malpractice. Rates of medical abuse are going to be higher among people who are at the doctor a lot more often because, again, by the number, you're seeing a lot more doctors, right? So again, when you look at the ways that those links in that chain kind of all pile together, you can see where that can lead to, for example, structural likelihood towards agoraphobia, towards PTSD from medical trauma, towards any number of mental health disabilities, but also just increased physical and cognitive stress that can predisposition people towards snapping or behaving in ways that might be maladaptive, but that can try to soothe kind of these underlying needs that are not being met or that are being kind of set off by these links in this longer chain. So when we're thinking about how to navigate risky behaviors, this is part of why we tend to talk about SAMHSA's 6 principles of trauma-informed care. So safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and neutrality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So all 6 of these ideas are kind of ways we can foreground the ways that we're approaching kind of dealing with these situations that we know are likelier to work well with people who have experienced trauma. Next slide, please. So additional risk factors to think about here, lack of communication supports. So what do I mean by that? Basically, ideas covered here are lack of language access in the first place when talking about access to ASL and sign language for deaf and hard of hearing folks, if that's the route they want to go down. Taking away access to augmented and alternative communication. So any form of, say, using a talker or tablet device, spelling, using letterboards, whatever method best suits people. Making that access conditional or not providing it in the first place is extremely frustrating. We are also talking about, in addition to expressive communication, so making sure people can understand what you're saying, when we talk about communication supports, we're also talking about receptive communication, so being able to understand what other people are saying. So, for example, if you have someone who is blind or low vision, if you are only providing information in such a way that they have to have, say, someone else read it to them, or they don't have the ability to receive that information privately, and that information is something private, that's also going to impact the level of frustration people have when interacting with you. So communication access is both really critical when thinking about being able to understand what's going on, but also as a fundamental human right and as a way for people to control the ways that they're able to communicate what they want, what their goals are, and just frankly, in the context of our society, how to be treated like a human person. An example that we point at a whole lot when talking about this is the film This Is Not About Me, which is a documentary about Jordan Zimmerman, who is an autistic, non-speaking woman who, from a fairly young age, wanted to be a teacher. And the film documents her experiences in kindergarten through 12th grade public school and how dramatically differently she was treated and what resources she had access to before and after she got access to a communication device. And fundamentally, the ways in which she was treated as though she could not learn, treated as though she could not understand what people around her were saying, including when they were talking about her, and fundamentally being treated as though she couldn't have goals or dreams of her own or things that she wanted beyond the basics. So it's really, really critical when looking at that film to kind of recognize kind of the night and day difference before and after people were listening to what Jordan had to say. And the difference in that for her was having access to a tablet to communicate and training and practice so that she could learn how to use it. But it was also that people were willing to listen in the first place because they were willing to believe she had something to say. So when we're looking at working with non-speakers especially, communication access is critical not just as a way to understand and talk to and fully grasp what people actually want and what their individual goals are, but also for kind of the gateway to being treated as a person in broader society. So yeah, when looking at risk factors for risky behaviors, that frustration, particularly around both being able to communicate in the first place, but also around the way that the rest of the world treats you, can absolutely contribute to the ways in which people might build up frustration. On that note, a steering committee member mentions that sensory needs have to be taken seriously and seen as an integral part of mental health care, and that our culture does not make time for breaks and meeting bodily needs. So again, when looking at the context of risky behaviors, thinking about sensory regulation and the ways that can kind of contribute. Next slide, please. So also things to think about here, a lot of the ways that people self-regulate can have similar needs to what non-disabled people want. So if you're having a drink at a bar, for example, maybe even if you're drinking a little bit more than you probably would be advised to normally, think about why you might be doing that. Maybe you're coping with social anxiety, maybe you're being peer pressured or feel kind of nervous about people thinking that you're a lightweight or that you're not super on the same level as other people who are drinking. Maybe you're dealing with trying to lower your inhibitions. Maybe you're trying to feel less nervous. All of those things are rooted in this need for connection with these people that you're around, right? So Similarly, yeah, disabled folks can do that for the same reasons. It might be coping with overstimulation and social anxiety. Disabled people are often held to a higher standard because, as disabled people, everything we do is kind of medicalized. So, an example that I come to when we talk about this is that of a professor friend that I have in Chicago who teaches disability studies. And one of the first things she does with her class is she gives them like a conversation prompt, and she'll say, "Hey, I've got this friend who lives in Chicago. He is a young adult. He's like 22. He lives with his parents. His diet's not the best. His room is kind of a mess. He's not in college yet. We don't know if he's going to be in college. He doesn't work currently. He's not really looking for work. What advice would you have for my friend?" And people had a lot of things to say about this. Some folks recommended a vocational coach or a counselor. Some people recommended getting them access to certain tools or home health care to try and have someone there to prompt him every day, all the way up to someone suggesting a restrictive environment like an institution or a mandatory day program. And that professor kind of would stop and she'd listen and she'd go, "Okay, so you've provided lots of different feedback. How would your feedback change if I told you that gentleman wasn't actually disabled?" And you just kind of watch everyone's faces fall in that moment, because people kind of collectively realized that if you were looking at someone you hadn't mentally cataloged as disabled, right? Just some random 22-year-old dude, you might have moral issues depending on your personal beliefs about him not currently going after a job, maybe not cleaning his room super well. Like, you might not feel like morally great about him, but you wouldn't have recommended voc rehab, you wouldn't have recommended a counselor, and you certainly wouldn't have recommended an institution based on just a 20-year-old dude being a slob and kind of relying on his parents. Like, people can have different moral ideas about that, absolutely. But when you take a disabled person who has the same demographics, 22-year-old dude, transition college age, suddenly it's a project. Suddenly it's a big deal, right? So that's kind of the framing device I used when talking about risky behavior too, is this reality that sometimes things that we do that people might disapprove of in terms of people in general suddenly become problems because of our disabilities, right? So that's that higher standard, that's kind of the difference. So when thinking about risky behavior as well, and particularly risk factors, something that I say sometimes is that the pain you know is better than the pain you don't. So if we're taking the example of someone possibly over drinking and getting rowdy at a bar, right? It might be, and it often can be, that the pain of being super inebriated and dealing with people in that state and risking the negative consequences might be the pain that they are more familiar with, and that feels less scary than being sober in a bar full of your friends and having to deal with the anxiety and the overstimulation and the physical pain that comes with those things, which might be less familiar, or maybe they are familiar with but feels worse. So when looking at self-regulation, that's kind of a piece to keep in mind, is that people are going for the lesser of two evils in their mind, the thing that they're more comfortable with, even if the thing they're comfortable with might not be the best adapted or the most suitable for their environment or for causing the least harm to themselves or others. Next slide. So other things to think about in terms of risky behavior, resource silos. Basically, as I'm sure folks have run into, there are very few supports that truly accommodate dual diagnosed people. One example of this is an Oregon man who was denied mental health support because clinicians thought his symptoms were just behaviors. This is an example of diagnostic overshadowing, which is basically saying that everything someone experiences is because of one diagnosis instead of recognizing that we can have multiple problems at once. So, for example, looking at an autistic person who might have what would otherwise clinically be diagnosed as a substance use disorder, or who might struggle with eating patterns that would traditionally be classified as an eating disorder, and just kind of going, oh, well, of course they're having a hard time. They're autistic. Heck, we don't need to give them resources around anything else because clearly this is all just related to the autism, right? And as a result of that, the risk factors there can lead to that buildup in frustration and people attempting to get control and get access through whatever means that they have, right? Next slide, please. So we're now going to transition into talking about how we support people doing risky behaviors. And I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to Jules.
Thank you, Noor. So when we're thinking about how to support people who are doing risky behaviors, something that we have to do is kind of change the lens that we're thinking about this through. So a lot of us probably growing up, right, when you do something bad, you get punished. And that is the lens that's being used right now with a lot of people is if you're engaging in a risky behavior, if you keep doing this behavior, you're going to face some kind of consequence. And we're going to talk about why that can be harmful as we go along here. But what we're really wanting to work toward is a restorative lens, which really asks, why is this behavior happening? And what can we do to sustainably stop or reduce the amount of harm that it's causing? And when we're talking about a restorative lens, accountability is a really key concept. Accountability doesn't mean that we're punishing someone and then giving up on them. It means that we help people understand natural consequences, so the things that happen as a direct result of the behavior, and then repair any harm that might be caused. So like the example that Noor gave earlier of somebody wearing roller skates without a helmet on and falling, right? The natural consequence is you fall and hit your head and that hurts. Those natural consequences we can't necessarily avoid, but when we're using a punitive lens, that's when we're introducing additional consequences on top of that. So you didn't wear your helmet and now you don't get to use your iPad for the next week or whatever. And so we can help people understand the natural consequences and repair any harm caused by those rather than adding additional punishment on top of that. So part of making this shift from a punitive lens to a restorative lens is figuring out what is behind the behavior. So we have a quote from one of our steering committee members, Perry, who says, "Observe the context behind a behavior. Don't just assume the person is doing it on purpose." And another steering committee, Micah, says, "These behaviors don't just come from nowhere. We have to think about the unmet need. People need to have choices in their day." So what this is all kind of getting at is we don't just do things for no reason. We don't just do things to be annoying or spite the people around us or whatever. Most of the time, risky behaviors are coming from a need that is not being met. And so a person is figuring out how to cope with that gap in a way that is potentially destructive to themselves or to other people. For example, let's say I'm super duper angry, and so I throw this mug across the room. So if I have a friend in the room with me, that's gonna probably make her feel really unsafe. So the needs that are present in the situation are, I need to release my anger. My friend needs to feel safe in her environment. So how can we kind of change what's happening to meet both of those needs? Well, maybe I can go off into another room and release my anger where, you know, it's not going to be jarring to anyone, or I can find a non-destructive or scary way to release that anger in that moment. So it's really thinking about like, what are the needs, kind of not just of the person doing the behavior, but also the needs of like everyone that's impacted by it, and how do we meet those needs? Oop. A really good way that or a really good metaphor that I like to share with people about this comes from a social justice practitioner named Richie Reseda, who has a really amazing organization called the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. So he supports incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people to basically help them not go back to jail. And this is a direct quote from him. So he says, "Justice is like detangling hair. We start with our and each other's actions, then carefully follow them back to the human needs those actions are based in. Just like we start with the ends of our hair and follow them back to the roots. Then we rearrange our actions in a way that respects everyone's needs. We can't get frustrated and cut someone's actions from the context of their needs, just like we can't just cut our hair off when we're detangling. It's the commitment to contextualizing people's actions in their needs that allows us to transform harm rather than cancel, commit war, and incarcerate each other." So what I really like the visual that metaphor provides for us, because I think a lot of times when the ways that we approach risky behaviors, we're just thinking about that tangled part of the hair, and a lot of what we're doing is trying to cut off that tangled part rather than getting back to the root and figuring out what caused that tangle, and how can we, work that out in a way that doesn't just like destroy the hair. A big part of being able to do that is actually having a really clear understanding of what's going on with this person and with their situations. So like those risk factors and the social determinants of health that Nora talked about are a really big piece of this. But kind of along with that, the way that we assess people and situations, both formally, like clinical assessments and stuff, and informal, so just like looking at a situation and thinking about what's going on, we have to kind of try to not only have one possibility in mind for what something could mean. So if I see someone doing something and I immediately think, oh, they're doing that because they're angry, right? If I pursue trying to support them from the perspective of they're doing this because they're angry, but that's not actually why they're doing it, then my support isn't going to be very helpful because it's not getting at that root cause. And so we have to expand kind of our realm of possibilities in our mind and be like, okay, sure, this could be because they're angry. It could also be because they're tired, or maybe they're hungry, or maybe they're scared, or maybe they're experiencing sensory overload, right? And so when we're assessing a situation and when we're listening to people, when they're explaining things to us, we want to listen and assess to understand, not just to like try to come up with a fix as quickly as possible. And a big part of that is understanding the cultural context and the values that we hold and that other people hold that shape how we behave and interact with each other. And so when we're talking about cultural differences, it's important to understand that risk is relative, right? What I might think is risky because of everything about how I was raised and how I live in the world could be very different from what you think is risky because of how you were raised and how you live in the world. As an example, in some cultures, casually joking or like teasing someone is considered really rude and something that you like should never do. In others, it's like a sign of affection to kind of like, give each other a hard time or whatever, right? And so it's important to understand the cultural context that someone is coming from. With that, kind of the other side of that coin, it's important not to generalize, because not everyone from the same place or background is exactly the same, right? And also, even if somebody comes from a certain background, as they're developing as a person and like, you know, learning and growing and becoming who they want to be, they may not want to stick to the norms of that culture. And so finding out both like where that person is coming from and how much they want to hold on to that, or what pieces of it they want to hold on to, is really important when we're kind of thinking about like the concept of risk. And along with that, it's really important to kind of approach these things with curiosity rather than judgment. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of listening to understand rather than to reply, right? So we're going in and trying to open our mind to lots of different possibilities of what could be going on, without kind of like adding our own opinions or judgment of what a person should be doing to the mix. So it's really important to kind of learn to recognize, okay, like what biases or assumptions do I have or am I making in this situation? And like, how is that impacting how I'm assessing what's going on? Come on, slides. There we go. So all of this plays into a really key component of supporting someone who's navigating risky behaviors, which is creating safety. Bottom line is that a person needs to feel safe in order to receive support, and in order to make positive changes. Because if you don't feel safe, it becomes a lot harder to focus on like making positive change if you're worried about trying to stop something negative from happening to you. One of the ways that a sense of safety often gets disrupted is through shame. If we shame people, it's impossible for them to feel truly safe. So a lot of times shame can look like you need to, you know, stop doing this thing that you're doing is bad and you're going to be punished if you keep doing this thing. What that can sound like to someone who's engaging in a risky behavior is, ooh, if I do this thing, I can't tell you about it, so I need to hide it. And that can result in a lot more harm to the person in the long run, because it's just delaying or like lessening the support that they can get because they're not able to share the whole picture of what's going on with the person trying to support them, because they don't feel safe to do that. It's important to remember that people who are struggling with risky behaviors or just struggling in general with mental health or anything, are dealing with fear, and what that fear is of or about is going to vary from person to person. But when we think about addressing fear, the kind of cure for fear is not punishment, right? That's just going to lead to more shame and more fear. It's connection. If we are going through something really tough, feeling like you're alone in it creates such a heightened sense of anxiety about what's going on. But knowing that you have someone that you can connect with about it really can lessen that fear, and kind of make the burden feel less heavy. One of the metaphors that I like to use is dough can't rise in a cold room. So, you know, if you're like making bread and you gotta proof your dough in a nice warm spot so that it can rise and get ready to bake. Just like dough can't rise in a cold room, people can't reduce harm in a hostile environment. So, you know, if you're trying to reduce or stop a risky behavior, or just trying to like get to a more stable place. It's really hard to do that if you don't feel like you're on the same team as the people who are there or who are ostensibly there to support you. And so that sense of safety is so important. Another thing that I wanted to address in terms of safety is oftentimes when we're thinking about navigating risky behaviors, we think about preventing them and dealing with them in the moment, but we don't talk as much about what happens afterwards. And one of our steering committee members, Micah, brought this up. They said, we need people to check in with us after meltdowns instead of just leaving us on our own. Now there are some people who like right after a meltdown might just need space to decompress, right? But what we don't want to do is like move on and pretend like it never happened, because that increases that sense of shame and feeling like, oh, like this big scary thing just happened to me, and like people are pretending like it didn't happen, so I need to like hide this feeling or this behavior that I just did. So we will talk more about concrete ways to plan aftercare towards the end of the presentation, but just wanted to add that in there as we're talking about safety. I'm just going to check on the chat real quick. Joseph, you have asked a question that I don't know how to answer. I'm gonna hold, or I don't know how to answer right in this moment, so I'm gonna think on it and get back to you. So one of the most valuable tools that we have in creating a sense of safety and building trust is harm reduction. Harm reduction, you may or may not be familiar with, either is fine because I'm about to explain it. It is a concept that a lot of people might know from the substance use world. So it's this idea in that context that if somebody is misusing substances, demanding abstinence, especially immediate abstinence, so demanding that they stop using that substance entirely immediately, is pretty unreasonable and often results in people just progressing to more like extreme patterns of substance misuse. So it's kind of, instead of doing that, making sure that if they're gonna be engaging with that substance, that they're doing it in a safe way, and that if abstinence is a goal for them, that we can help them taper that substance use down over time in a more sustainable way. The reason that harm reduction is so effective, both in the context of substance use, but also just like more broadly, is because it takes the shame and stigma out of the behavior. So instead of saying, this thing you're doing, it's terrible and you need to stop immediately, or you're going to face XYZ consequence, we're saying, hey, like, we recognize that this is like a really difficult thing that you're dealing with, and let's like figure out how to make sure you're doing it as safely as possible, while we work on like addressing what's causing you to engage in that behavior in the first place. And that makes it a lot easier for people to be honest about the help that they need, to be honest about the situations that they're facing, and much easier to create that like safe environment that we talked about earlier. So an example of harm reduction outside of a substance use context would be cutting. So cutting in terms of self-injury. So there are kind of like the tangible tools of harm reduction, where we think about things like sterile blades, right? So if somebody's going to be cutting themselves we want to make sure that they're not using like a rusty or dirty blade, because that can give them an infection. We want to make sure that they have like materials and training to properly care for the wounds that will come out of cutting, so that they don't get an infection, or they don't cut, you know, like too deeply or in a more dangerous place. And this concept of tapering applies here as well, where instead of saying, okay, you're cutting, you need to stop right now, 100%, we can set small goals that we kind of take baby steps over time. So let's say a person is like regularly cutting their entire forearm. Maybe our goal for this next week is to keep any new cuts in a smaller area, like in just one part of your arm, right? Or if someone is cutting every day, let's set a goal for this next week to have one day where you try not to cut. And a lot of people, when they're first hearing this idea, they're like, oh my gosh, this is crazy, because like it sounds like you're endorsing these harmful behaviors, and like you're telling people that it's okay to harm themselves. That's not the point at all. Harm reduction takes a demonstrably more realistic approach to supporting people engaging in risky behaviors, because we know that, especially in the beginning of supporting someone when they're like really actively in crisis, demanding that they stop doing something that they've relied on as a coping mechanism for maybe a long time, demanding that they stop doing that immediately is not realistic. And even if they do, it's more likely that they're gonna repeat that pattern of behavior at some point in the future. And so the goal of harm reduction is to say, hey, we know you're probably going to be doing this in some capacity. Let's make sure that you don't cause additional unintentional harm to yourself or other people while you're engaging in that behavior. So it's important to remember harm reduction strategies won't work if you keep the person who needs support in like a stressful environment where they feel shamed. So that's like, we can use all the tools of harm reduction, and we need to keep that like creating safety piece in mind. And it's also kind of like a package deal. So if we think about harm reduction strategies as like dealing with the tangled bit of hair, and the like kind of listening and assessing as like dealing with like the root of the hair closer to the scalp, we need to be working on both of those things at the same time to like fully untangle the strand and keep it from getting tangled again, right? So we can't work on the behavior without learning how to meet the unmet need that's causing somebody to do that behavior. One of our steering committee members, Emily, says self-harm can feel like a way to take control. Yeah, I mean, that's a really clear example of like, that's the unmet need that's causing the behavior. And our steering committee member, Danielle, said self-injury for stimming versus for self-punishment are different things. Taking it out on yourself instead of someone else because you'll get in less trouble. This is a really good example of why context and understanding context is so important, because you could have two people doing the same behavior. Let's say it's hitting yourself in the head, right? One person might be doing it because they just like how it feels and it gives them a positive sensory like sensation. Someone else might be doing it because they are angry and they actually want to hit the person next to them, but they know if they do that, they'll get in a lot of trouble. So they take it out on themselves instead. So even though the behavior is the same, the root cause of the behavior is different, and that informs the way that we would support the person in either scenario. So while we talk a lot about risk factors and what's causing someone to engage in a risky behavior, we also want to keep protective factors in mind, which are things that might make it easier for someone to stop engaging in a behavior. Protective factors are parts of a person's life that can help them be safe and happy. one of the most important protective factors in anyone's life is the relationships that we have. If we have positive relationships with our caregivers, family, friends, providers, that sets us up for success in so many different ways. There are communication that we were talking about earlier. Having consistent access to a robust method of communication is another huge protective factor, that makes it easier for people to express themselves, and be able to deal with their emotions in a healthier way. Our steering committee member Micah says, we need to use strength-based interventions. Protective factors can help us keep people in a better state of mind. And this is really true because often when we're talking about supporting people with risky behaviors, we're always thinking about the negative and what needs to stop. But it's also really important to focus on what are the things that are going well in that person's life, and how can we build from that to kind of tip the scales in a more positive direction. And before I turn it back over to Nora, I'm just going to check the chat one more time. Yeah, Joseph. So Joseph asks, have you considered behaviors are a result of too much success? They are afraid of too much success or good. It is also difficult if the person may not have the cognitive ability. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. So I think oftentimes it can be really difficult, especially for people who are non-speaking or who don't have access to robust communication. Sometimes we look at that and say they're not communicating anything and therefore there's nothing for us to assess here, when in reality what's happening is often they are trying to communicate something, but the only things that we're paying attention to are those super escalated situations. And that can be really, that can just lead to more escalated behavior, because if a person feels like that's the only way they can get someone's attention, that's what they're going to do. And yeah, I think just for the sake of time, I'm gonna turn it back over to Noor.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also going to note, Joseph, based on the descriptions of things you've put in chat so far, what that's reading as to me is going back to what we're talking about in terms of going back to the root. So if someone is, as you're putting it, kind of self-sabotaging, that can often be kind of a self-fulfilling cycle. And obviously, I do not know you directly, so I cannot speak to your direct situation. However, there can often be a pattern where if someone recognizes that when they make a mistake or when they engage in certain actions, what have you, that they result in a punishment, there can be sort of a presumptive fear cycle where it goes basically, oh, well, I'm doing really well right now, but anytime I mess up, everything falls apart and I get punished and everything is bad. And then we go back to the pain you know is better than the pain you don't. So being afraid of, is this going to feel worse? Is this going to be worse? If I get to experience what it's like to have times where I'm not being punished, when I know that that's what's coming, when I feel this fear of failure and that immediately what's going to happen is that I'm going to be back to square one and I'm just going to be hurting again. So what you get back to is working back from that tangle up to the root. It can be both a result of the ways in which that person has come to like understand how punishment works, and that in some cases people might fear that it's a direct result of who they are, or some inherent part of them rather than what they're doing, but also the ways in which they're incentivized or disincentivized, frankly, from thinking critically about the roots of what's leading to outbursts or discomfort or pain that is leading to being punished, right? So again, when we're talking about autonomy in this context and the idea that someone gets to make choices about their life, people with IDD and mental health disabilities, and also, to put it very directly, for people with intellectual disabilities especially, a lot of the time folks have had choices taken away from them throughout their lives, and regardless of the context in which this has happened, it is a type of trauma. And so when we're looking at trying to understand the roots of how like certain patterns of behavior emerge, it's important to look at what the underlying need is that isn't being met, or what the underlying emotional root is that is leading to kind of this ongoing chain. So trauma-informed care for people with this experience means giving them lots of choices. Yes, so again, when talking about how the punishment reinforcement cycle, that can also lead back to kind of this broader thing of like kind of a reinforcing cycle of kind of folks both internally and within the broader system not understanding what the root is versus kind of just associating set actions with set punishments. Next slide, please. So some quotes from our steering committee members, rather. Alicia notes, we need to find ways to stop repeatedly traumatizing people by making them relive their trauma every time they go to get services. Kim notes that PTSD can trigger meltdowns and vice versa, and that we need to pay attention to the relationship between these things. So sometimes we just need space, don't keep poking the bear. So again, noting that people will have different preferences around being comforted after a meltdown, and that it's good to clarify those things ahead of time. Monica notes that the system is not transparent with people receiving treatment, and that doing that means that we have to treat adults like adults and make them aware of consequences. Micah notes meltdowns are part of life and that non-disabled people also have bad days. They note, my emotions can be big sometimes, so we need to co-create plans to deal with meltdowns rather than trying to get them to go away entirely. Next slide, please. So rolling up towards some tools that folks can use for providing choices. Basics here are access to communication methods and devices, accessible information, freedom to mask and unmask and stim without judgment, collaborative planning tools that can be useful here. On the Link Center's resources page, we have tips to manage triggers, which is a resource made by Max Barrows and Perry. Those talk about ways to help people recognize what triggers they have and to think about ways to approach handling them. What to do when I don't feel okay from Ren Cololoni at Communication First is a plain language worksheet that helps people understand what crisis planning is and talks them through some options for how to do it. Pod mapping from Mia Mingus and the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective is another kind of flat worksheet that helps people plan what they want to happen in case of a crisis or a meltdown, folks that they might want contacted or not contacted, and practical next steps. The ASAN website also has a resource on supported decision making that might be helpful here. And with that, next slide. We are going to go ahead and break into the group exercise. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to the Link Center.
Awesome. Thank you, Noor and Jules, for such great and impactful information. We really appreciate it. I learned a lot myself, and we want to bring this back around to having all of you share some information with us about what you've learned and hopefully apply it to some of the situations that you may find yourself in. And as we move toward this, just to give a little instruction to you, by the way, my name is Maria Crowley. I'm a part of the Link Center as a partner. I am a white female. I'm wearing a black and white shirt, and I have silver hair, and I have the Link Center information as a background. In terms of instructions, you have a scenario in front of you that talks a little bit about a risky behavior. What we hope in terms of taking a look at this, we'd love to hear from you about what you think about this particular scenario and this topic by talking about this with us. There are not any wrong answers. We believe that you all are experts in this regard. You know your own experiences, and we want to hear about those. With me is Carly Winnie. Carly, would you also like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Carly Winnie. I am the Chief Operating Officer at NAD. And for those who can't see me, I am a middle-aged white woman with graying hair. I'm wearing kind of a, I don't know, blue-green sweater. Our group discussion prompt today is your loved one who has regularly ended up with welts on her arms from repeatedly slapping them, and you feel worried. What are some questions you can ask to better understand the situation? So we would love for you to either, share your thoughts and comments in the chat, or if you'd like to come off mute and speak with us, that would be fine also.
Either way, we really would love to hear from you, and maybe think through some of the things that Nora and Jules shared with you in terms of whether or not, you feel this person is at risk of justice involvement, if this person is self-regulating, are they harming other people with the behavior that they're engaging in? Do you feel like they're safe? Maybe their need to self-connect with this? Do any of those things come to mind as you're reading through this? That's a really good point, Casey. What are the times this person feels like engaging in this behavior? Is there something triggering this behavior?
Casey also asked, do you feel better after doing this? Another great question.
Mm-hmm. Good point, Joseph. Is there some other behavior to substitute for this one?
Yep, or Braden suggested if they're stressed, maybe they could take a mindful moment.
That's another good point from Patrick. How do you feel before engaging in the behavior?
Yeah, Joseph, that's a, you know, a good example of, you know, taking that mindful moment. Joseph said we try breathing exercises with our son. And that, you know, that can be great for, you know, calming and soothing.
Yeah, Braden says having a fidget ball to help relieve the stressful behavior. I think all of these are really good places to start. And I really like the questions that people are asking to kind of try to get to the why behind what's happening. So if we go to the next slide, we get a little bit more information. Maria, do you want to read that out?
Sure. Let's say that she indicates that she's slapping her arms because she likes the feeling and it helps her stay focused on whatever she's doing at the moment. What are some options for harm reduction you might be able to do based on that? What comes to mind?
Yeah, Casey makes a great point here, which someone else brought up in one of our sessions yesterday. So we're coming at this from the point that like this behavior, like we need to stop it from happening, right? But Casey asked, is harm reduction needed? Is the slapping causing injury? Yeah, sure. It might be abnormal to us, right? to see someone slapping themselves to stay focused. But if they're not seriously hurting themselves, and they're not hurting anyone else around them, maybe it's okay for them to just do this behavior. And so that's like a great example of thinking about whether we're like projecting our own judgment and biases onto the situation. Janet makes a great point, which is, sounds like she likes the feedback from the pain in her arm. Would there be a better way to get feedback? So yeah, let's say that maybe she does want to or she is like actually hurting herself in a serious way from slapping herself, or she does want to find another way to channel this energy. Maybe there are different fidget tools that we could use that would provide a similar sensation. Maybe it speaks to a need for having a movement break or something while she's like working on something that requires a lot of focus. What's really important to remember when we're kind of going through those different options is that for a lot of people, we're not going to nail it on the first try. It's going to take some trial and error to figure out what works for us. And so just being open to having that trial and error, keeping the lines of communication open, and being willing to kind of collaboratively figure that out with the person is important. Braden also said, is causing a commotion a harmful reduction? And I think, Braden, I think maybe what you mean is like, is causing a commotion from this person slapping herself, like causing harm to people around her. And that's something else to consider with the situation too, right? So if she's just doing this when she's alone in her room, probably not. There's no one else there. But if she's in a classroom setting and it's distracting other students, that's where we need to go back to that idea of balancing the needs of everyone in the environment, right? So we're thinking about how can we meet her need to get this stimulation to stay focused while also meeting the needs of other people who don't want to be distracted from what they're doing. So it's a very context dependent situation, but that's why, you know, we like to think about all these questions we might ask so that we can think about how we would address all the different parts of this scenario.
Jules, this might be a stretch, but I wonder too if there's some auditory satisfaction that comes with that might could be alleviated in some other way.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it was really interesting. In one of our sessions yesterday, someone took even a further step back because, we're in this context where we're assuming that she's got welts on her arms because she's hitting herself, right? But somebody in our, I think it was in our clinical professional setting yesterday, asked, maybe a question we should ask is, are you allergic to anything? Because maybe the welts are coming from her having an allergic reaction to something and it's not related to the slapping, right?
Right.
So like, that's a great example of the diagnostic overshadowing thing we were talking about earlier, where if we're assuming that all of this is happening because of a disability or a specific thing, we might actually be missing the root cause, which could be totally unrelated. So that's why doing that that exploration and approaching things with curiosity is really important.
Right. Which Mary was kind of getting at, as well in the chat. She's asking the same thing. You are of like minds. Joseph added an additional comment about the challenge when staff sometimes is in the middle. It is difficult to know what to do as well as to de-escalate. Sometimes there is a challenge there. Awesome. I'm being mindful of our time. So Stacy, we appreciate all of the great comments and the group discussion, and I'm looking at the time, so we're going to turn it back over to you.
Super. Thanks so much, Maria. If we could advance to the next slide, please. So, that was such a great discussion, and hopefully all of the things that Nora and Jules said today really gives you some, perhaps even different ways to be thinking about supporting someone. And so we want to ask you again and wonder if there's anything that you heard today that changes the way you think about the words risky behaviors. We'd really just love to get some final reactions from you all just about what you heard today. So if you want to drop your thoughts in the chat, that will be great. And, please continue to add to the chat also, any of your go-to resources, training, websites, just the places that you go to get information and supports that will help us develop materials and just really inform us at the Link Center about where you go for information to navigate risky behaviors. As we said, we have the website and we're really looking to make this a place that people can go for information sources, etc. So here's a schedule of past and upcoming shared learning groups. You will be able to find recordings, transcripts, and materials on the Link Center website. You'll be able to register for upcoming shared learning. And we're so very excited about the next topic in the beginning of the new year, which is moving through the justice system. And again, just wanted to remind you that you can visit the Link Center's website at any time. So here's the address and links on your screen. You can use the QR code as well. Excuse me. And we're going to, drop the Link Center address in the chat so you can have easy access. But please also email us at the Link Center if you have questions or suggestions, anything that really bubbles up for you after our time together today that maybe you're thinking about. And we, again, are just really loving to hear from those of you with the lived experience, those of you who are also thinking about how can we better support people with co-occurring conditions. Finally, we do have a quick evaluation. We're really hoping that you take just a couple more minutes to complete this for us. On the screen is the QR code, and you can scan that with your phone. We'll also put the link in the chat. It will also pop up when you close out a Zoom today. And then finally, as if those weren't enough bombardments for completing our survey, we'll send it out to everyone in an email. We're just really committed to getting feedback from you all to really help us make improvements for future shared learning groups, webinars, and any other products that we create as part of the Link Center. And just a huge thank you again today to our partners from ASAN, Jules Good and Nor Pervez. We really appreciate you and the work that you do and as partners on this grant. We'd also like to thank members of the Link Center Steering Committee for their time and valuable input for these shared learning groups. And thank you also to ACL and all of our partners for contributing to the preparation of and content for this meeting. So that's all that we have for you today. We appreciate you joining us, taking time out of your very busy days, and we really hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks so much.